Chapter 9, key issue 4, is about obstacles to development, and it covers a lot. So there's two primary paths to development we'll talk about, and we'll talk about the shortcomings of the different paths and why international trade has really triumphed aside from globalization. And we'll explain the sources of financing development, what are the problems with financing development, excuse me, what are the principles of fair trade, and how do different differences in developed state, how do these paths either become more narrow or widened over time? So the two primary paths to development for a developing country would be either self-sufficiency or international trade. So the first part of the 20th century, self-sufficiency was the most popular. And it was definitely a reaction to colonialism. So self-sufficiency was the idea that each country would make its own path. So they encouraged domestic production of goods. They discouraged foreign ownership of businesses and resources. And they really just wanted to protect their businesses from international competition. And it was most popular during the 20th century. Again, the first part. So like India would be a good model for self-sufficiency, and that's the example your book uses, so make sure you read that. And then the other model that happened really kind of increased in popularity during the late 20th century is international trade. And in international trade, countries open themselves up to foreign investments in international markets. So some of the barriers to self-sufficiency means that you don't import goods from other places. You focus on just goods from your country, which can limit the amount of goods in your country. It also means that businesses don't compete with international corporations. And this over time leads to just government subsidizing of businesses. So the businesses don't really have to succeed or fail on their own. So it also leads to a lot of corruption. Investment is spread equally across all economic sectors. And across the whole country. And so even things that don't really have a good chance or are failing industries still get their financing. And it does minimize discrepancy in wages across urban and rural dwellers. And that was with the intent to reduce poverty. And that definitely is a positive of it, because not everything is bad. The international trade path follows really something called Rostow's model. And as we go through Rostow's model, it should seem pretty familiar to you because it kind of goes along with the demographic transition model. So in stage 1, you're a traditional society. You have a high percentage of people engaged in agriculture and a high percentage of national wealth that's used for non-productive activities like the military. In stage 2, you have the preconditions for takeoff. So you have an elite group that initiates an innovative economic activity, and that stimulates an increase in productivity. Stage 3 is the actual takeoff. Now you've got rapid growth of your economy, and it's generated by a limited number of economic activities. And so now your country is kind of specializing, whether it's in electronics or making textiles, but you've realized that as a country, you can succeed better on the international market if you specialize in one or two things instead of trying to master them all. In stage 4, you drive to maturity. So that's you've got modern technology. You've got your few industries that are driven by technology, and these are tied to other economic activities, so like consumer-based sectors or tertiary economic sectors. And this means that you've got, like more tourism, more stores, more hotels, more restaurants. And this leads off to rapid economic growth. And then stage 5 is the age of mass consumption. That's where we're at. And this is marked by a shift from heavy industry, like producing steel, to producing consumer goods. If you look here at Rostow's stage of development, you've got traditional society. And if you look at stage 1, the demographic transition model, you've got, rural traditional society. Stage 2, transitional stage, preconditions for takeoff. Stage 2 here, transitional, right, pre-industrial. Stage 3, takeoff. Right here, you've got the move from rural to urban areas, population stabilizing. Stage 4, drive to maturity. Stage 5, high consumption. And so while it doesn't completely go along with the DTM, you can see a lot of parallels. So that maybe will help you remember it because we spent a lot of time on this DTM. So what are the shortcomings? In self-sufficiency, they protect ineffective businesses. High prices are made possible by isolation from international corporation. It leaves little incentive for businesses to improve the quality. There's not much innovation because they know that you're really limited. You have to buy it, and so it's not always made better. And you don't, because you're protected from international corporations don't keep up with the rapid technological changes. And in order to maintain a path of development based on self-sufficiency, you need a large bureaucracy. And a large bureaucracy can sometimes encourage inefficiency, abuse, and corruption. As far as international trade challenges, you have uneven resource distribution. So you know that your commodity prices aren't guaranteed to rise faster than the cost of the products. So as a corporation, you may not make it because you're competing. You have increased dependence on developed countries, and this is what made this plan so unattractive for many countries that were escaping from the colonial era. If they didn't want to be dependent on European countries or North America anymore, they wanted to be separate. And then market decline. If you have a world market that no longer calls for your goods, you're not going to be able to sell it. So you have to be able to really predict what kind of goods you want to specialize in. Since the late 20th century, most countries have embraced the international trade approach. Trade has increased more rapidly than wealth when you measure it by GDP. And the optimism about the benefits of this development are based on three observations. One, if existing developed countries use this approach, then why wouldn't developing countries find success using it as well? Two, the sales of raw materials would generate funds for developing countries that could promote development. So instead of borrowing all the money, using those primary sector jobs, things like mining or cutting down lumber, that could provide the startup funds for your development. And a country that concentrates on international trade will benefit from exposure to the demands, needs, and preferences of consumers in other countries. And that is certainly true. If we look at trade as a percentage of GDP, we see that in developed countries, it's risen, it stayed high, except for here's the recession, the global recession in 2008. But it's risen slowly, but stayed stable. But for developing countries, the trade as a percentage of their GDP has experienced rapid growth. Where do you get the money for development? You get it from two main places. You can get it from a transnational corporation, or you can get it from loans from banks and international organizations. FDI stands for Foreign Direct Investment. These are investments that are made by a foreign company to the economy of another country. Foreign direct investments grew from $130 billion in the 1990s to $1.5 billion in 2000 and 2010. In 2010, only 2/5 went from developed to developing countries. And most places that provide FDI are transnational corporations. As far as loans from international organizations, you get most of the loans from the World Bank. The World Bank includes the International Bank for the Reconstruction and Development and the International Development Association. They provide loans to countries to reform administration, to reform legal institutions, and to develop and strengthen financial institutions, as well as implementing transportation and social service projects. The IDA often provides support to countries that are considered too risky to receive loans from the IBRD. If you look at these countries here, the darker countries have debt as a percentage of the GNI, 50% and above. And you actually see that most developed countries have a higher percentage of debt as a percentage of their GNI as compared to developing countries. We also have two major lenders to developing countries. The second is the International Monetary Fund, which maybe you've heard of. The IMF provides loans to countries that are experiencing a balance of payment problems, and this could threaten their expansion of international trade. So the IMF provides assistance that's designed to help a country rebuild their international reserves, stabilize their currency exchange rates, and pay for imports without the imposition of harsh trade restrictions or capital controls. So the World Bank focuses on public administration, legal institutions, and financial institutions, and things like transportation and social services, while the IMF focuses on building reserves and currency exchange rates. Both the IMF, the World Bank, and developed countries fear that granting, canceling, or refinancing debts without strings attached will perpetuate bad habits. So developing countries are required to prepare a policy framework paper that outlines a structural adjust program, including things like economic goals, strategies for achieving the objectives, and external financing requirements. So what are they going to do with the money? How is it going to improve their country? The global economic crisis in developed countries in 2008 was was due to the poor condition of banks and other financial institutions. So we spread bad loans throughout, the developed world, and that led to a housing bubble, and this led to the rapid increase in the value of houses, which then burst, There was a sharp decline in their value. So these bad loans we had in the developed world impacted the entire world, including the developing countries. How do we mark progress in development? So a man called Emanuel Wallerstein, he was a social scientist, he posited the world systems analysis, and this unified the world economy with developed countries forming the core area, and developing countries occupied peripheral locations. Developing countries in the periphery have less access to the world center of consumption. They have less access to communications, wealth, power, all of which is clustered in the core. And you guys should recognize some of these areas because you did your locations projects, based on your core countries, which were mostly in Europe, Australia, the United States, and Japan. And then you had your semi-peripheral countries, So central parts of South America, and a lot of Eastern Europe and East Asia. And then your peripheral countries. So these are countries that don't have as much money. And you can kind of see it here, more developed countries, less developed countries. This map is based on his original work in the 70s. This is a more modernized one. Another way to look at the global poor versus the global wealthy is to look at something called the Brandt line, where you have higher developed countries above in the northern hemisphere, except for Australia, and then less developed countries in the southern hemisphere. So the Brandt line is another way of looking at that core peripheral model. So how do we make that gap smaller? We want to reduce the gap in the level of development between developed and developing countries. And what are we looking at to decide if it's working? So if we look at infant mortality rate, we have lowered that gap, Life expectancy has not narrowed. And the GNI per capita, the gap in wealth between developed and developing countries, has widened. So the HDI value, infant mortality is decreasing, and life expectancy globally is increasing, but we want to make sure that we want to make this more narrow. We want there to be less of a difference between a developing country and a more developed country. The GNI per capita, again, this gap is really wide, but overall we do see a GNI increasing, but we want to bring these countries up higher. Fair trade, you've probably heard about before. Fair trade is when commerce and products are made and traded according to the standards that protect workers and small businesses in developing countries. So you see something like fair trade chocolate or fair trade wool. They bypass distributors, so most of the retail price goes back to the people who are making it. So fair trade is a great socially responsible purchase for you to make if it really is fair trade. Fair trade requires the employers with that stamp to pay workers fair wages, permit unions to come about, and comply with minimum environmental and safety standards. So if you have the choice to buy a fair trade product or another product, fair trade will help the people in the developing country making your product far more. And here's some fair trade coffee. And here's a good summary of the chapter. And that is it for Chapter 9. Our test will be on Thursday.